how do you like the background image? Anybody have positive response? I was
What
really,
library is it,
huh?
Professor?
I'm
What
sorry.
is it a famous library?
What it is I looked for famous libraries, it sort of gives the professorial vibe, but I wanted a nice sort of background to look at as well. And I saw various things they didn't really work. So I asked Chat GTP, and I really like it. All right, let's turn to the class. We left off with watching a video by Drew Barry that showed us what the processes inside the cell look like. And it should disabuse us of any idea, one that, for example, I harbored for most of my life, that the cell was just this big mass of goo with molecules randomly bumping into one another. It's not that. It's a highly programmed uh, collection of little robots running around delivering energy and other supplies to other objects. And the video we watched was just about the replication of a single cell. Now, the process of morphogenesis, where you go from a zygote uh, to you with roughly 10 to the 14th cells, and you don't come out like just a blob on the floor, shows another level of sophistication and subtle programming. So I think it's best to think of the cell as a computer. Uh, it's computing stuff, and it's a molecular computer, and we'll get into that later. All right. So we're going to continue reading this stuff.
After Darwin, generations of distinguished biologists would refine the theory. To recall them all would require recounting a large part of the history of biology, so I will content myself with recalling what is arguably the most important refinement. In 1953, Watson and Crick published their masterpiece, A Structure for Deoxyribose Nucleic Acid, Watson and Crick, 1953. The now ubiquitous double helix had been revealed. The agent of biological evolution had been found. The paper.
Okay, so this is Watson and Crick. And they've got this sort of wiry model built up, and it's showing a double helix. All right. Okay, continuing here.
The paper contains the famous understatement. It has not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material.
Now that's about the best understatement I can recall ever seeing. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, but let's go over it. In a cartoon fashion, this is what Watson and Crick discovered. And they discovered that there were actually two strands of DNA forming a double helix physically, looks like a double helix, and that these two strands were connected by what are called base pairs. And every A would be opposite of T, A, T, no matter how it happened, and every C would be opposite of G, CG. Now, there are other chemical things that can occur in DNA, but this is the basic setup. And so when you look at that, why does that tell us how this thing's going to replicate? That somehow or other, DNA is going to produce new inside the cell, is going to be able to replicate. And if you have one DNA strand, double helix, you can use it to build another one. Why is that obvious from this?
Well, all the A's match with the T's and the C's match with the G's. So if you only have one strand, there's just like a unique set of base pairs for every starting base pair. So you could make the copy.
Absolutely right, Nathan. And basically, these two strands store the same sequence. It's true that there's a slight transaction, but if we step back a little further, they store the same information. These two strands do. And so it's pretty clear that by ripping the double helix apart, you get a template on which you can build the other strand by obeying base pairing rules. And both those strands can be used as uh, a template to build a new double-strand DNA. So when this is a startling thing to have learned in 1953, because it isn't just that you had discovered that nucleic acids contained the sort of genetic information that had been known before Watson and Crick, but finding its structure just immediately opened our eyes to, well, what processes must be going on in the cell. All right. So in terms of replication, for example. All right. So moving on.
Presumably, it also did not escape many biologists' notice that mutation of DNA in sexual reproduction could give rise to the variation so critical to Darwin's original theory.
All right. Those footnotes marks indicate that I had something to say here. I'm not sure what it was. Okay. Oh, I did want to make a remark that we're going to talk about genes in this course, and biologists talk about genes all the time, with good reason. But they usually mean that a gene is a sequence of DNA that, quote, encodes a protein. That is, it's a sequence which is used to make proteins. We won't have any such restriction. A gene will be, roughly speaking, and this is rough, just a sequence of A, T, Cs, and Gs. All right. And also it is clear that when you look at the this, that how are mutations going to occur? Well, at least some mutations are going to occur because one of these bases, double-stranded piece of DNA is going to get hit by, let's say, a cosmic ray and get messed up just as a molecule. The bases are little molecules. And uh, that is going to change the DNA. And that change could be called a mutation. All right. So it brings us to the following, which I've written here because this
For
highlighted some.
millennia, biology has been viewed as the study of living things. But after
And that's the standard definition of biology, the study of living things. I mean, the word itself means the study of living things.
Darwin and his successors, a second view of biology as the study of genes has emerged.
Okay, so now you can view biology two ways. It's the study of genes or it's the study of living things. Okay. And
From this view, living things are seen as instruments used by their genes to preserve and reproduce themselves. While some may see these views as competitive, I see them as largely synergistic. Together, they have transformed our understanding of biology.
from the view of the study of genes, it gives us a very different view that living things are seen as instruments used by the genes to preserve and reproduce themselves, by which I mean the genes. That is, it's not a very flattering look at, for example, humans. It's saying humans or bacteria or viruses, they are just vehicles for the genes. They're the way the genes get replicated. They're built to serve the genes, and that what we should really be paying attention to is the genes.
Professor,
Yes,
I think one interesting. I remember talking
Julian.
to someone. Yes, Julian. I remember talking to someone once about how human aging, humans past reproductive age. So maybe when sperm count decreases or humans hit menopause, they age terribly, and their bodies are not good at fixing themselves. So if they get sick or they break a bone, they're not as good at repairing tissue or bone marrow or anything. So maybe and the reason they bring up this point is that humans evolved to reproduce. Humans didn't evolve to live long because evolution doesn't care how long you live, it just cares, are you able to make more? So I think in that sense, yeah, we can be seen as just instruments to reproduce.
Yeah, that's very good. It's discussed extensively in the book Darwin Turing Dawkins, wherein there's a whole chapter on the question of why, when, and how, or several chapters, why, when, and how you're going to die. Okay. So And it's very much related to what you're saying, though it's not quite perfectly correct what you said, Julian. Women who hit menopause, it's argued in that DTD means Darwin Turing Dawkins, so I don't have to keep saying it. It's argued in DTD that in fact, when women hit menopause, they do not experience the decline that perhaps men do when they get older. And there's a very good reason for this. And just to foreshadow it, it has to do with the fact that women have babies. And so young babies might have less chance of surviving and producing another generation if the mother dies too soon. So it's really an interesting discussion and one that I think we might enjoy going into. So if you want to know why you're going to die, I'll tell you why. If you want to know when and how, I'll give you suggestions. So there are these two views of biology.
While some may see these views as competitive, I see them as largely synergistic. Together, they have transformed our understanding of biology. Social science has long been
Okay. Starting here.
Social science has long been viewed as the study of human society and social relationships, OED.
So, Christina, thanks. Good to see you again, because you may be our only person close to sociology in this meeting. So I appreciate your views. Okay, so this is a sort of classical definition of what sociology is. The study of human societies and social relationships. Okay. So that's sort of the analog of biology being the study of living things. And here's an
The
important
question
question.
arises as to whether a complementary view of social science as the study of some agent analogous to genes might be of value. It appears that it can, and the agent of societal evolution is the cultural preen, which will soon be defined. Preen.
Okay, so this is sort of the important part of On the Origin of Societies, that there's a claim being made here that there is an analog of the gene, and it's about to be described. The genes are to biology what cultural preens are to sociology. Okay, so now we get to what is a preen?
What is a preen? Let's begin with a related question. What is a gene?
All right, we're going to begin with that related question. So somebody tell me what a gene is. Anybody willing to take a shot at that?
It's a sequence of letters.
Uh,
That was João again.
oh, thank you. It's a sequence of letters, A, T, C's, and G's, I assume you're saying. Okay. Well, that is one view. I don't think it's the view that most biologists learn.
I would say it's information that's stored in maybe like DNA and passed down.
Raise your hand or wiggle your hand.
My name's Akriti.
Yeah, hi, Akriti. Okay, yes. Please say it again.
Akriti. Or do you
Oh, I
or
have
the
to make your
definition?
comment, Akriti. Yeah.
I would say it's information stored in something like DNA and passed down.
Yeah, that's getting, I think, closer to what a biologist would say. Let me ask you this. Is the notion of a gene important in biology?
Yes.
Yes. And how long have we had the notion of gene around? Does anybody know? When did it first enter the English language? I think it was about 100 years ago. So it's been around for a century. Let's see. Oh, by the way, preens, which are going to be big in this course, as you know, is a portmanteau. An interesting word. I love this word. But anyway, it means the putting together of two words to form something new. So it comes from primary and gene, preen. That's where this came from. All right. So what is a gene? Back to this.
Here is what you'll find in the Oxford English Dictionary.
Is that working? Thanks.
Dictionary, OED, 2022. 1. Biology. The basic unit of heredity in living organisms, originally recognized as a discrete physical factor associated with the inheritance of a particular morphological or physiological trait, and later shown to be located at a specific site on a chromosome and to consist of a sequence of DNA, or RNA in certain viruses, containing a code for a protein or RNA molecule, together with any associated sequences necessary for transcription and translation. This is not a very precise definition. For example, what exactly does the basic unit of heredity mean? Nonetheless, the notion of a gene is of great importance in biology, and OED-type definitions are useful in that field. From the OED definition we could extract the following. A gene is a basic unit of heredity that can be stored in DNA and RNA.
Okay, so that much we could extract from the definition. All right, and
Can I ask something to clarify?
yes,
So like
Fatih,
Fatih, yes.
Fatih,
So then
yeah.
like when we look at some like DNA, then like it's not actually like well defined where a gene starts and ends. Is it like how
I missed a few words, Fatih. When we look at a DNA molecule, yes, what?
yeah, like how do we know like where a gene starts and ends like in this sequence of letters? Like is it even like well defined or it's just some like made up notion actually?
No, I think when we look at a molecule of DNA, which I think you mean the double helix,
Mhm.
we can, there's some subtleties here. Actually, in the laboratory, if we want, figure out whether the left-hand side of it is an A, T, C, or G. And then we can figure out what the next symbol is, an A, T, C, or G. So the DNA is this so-called backbone on which A, T, C, and G are just hung one after the other. And so, yes, a piece of DNA has that sequence of A, T, Cs, and Gs, which stand for the nucleobases, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and not uracil.
I mean,
Adenine, thymine. Uh, okay. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Fatih. Did I?
I mean, like, is every subsequence in a DNA can be considered as a gene, like under this
Oh,
definition?
yes. In my view, that's a good way to look at it. That is, if let's say you had a whole bunch of a very long sequence of DNA, and let's say it was ATCG, ATCG, ATCG repeated, then it would have the subsequence AT in it. And yes, I think it's good to keep in mind that AT is then a gene. All right. Any subsequence of a longer sequence would also be a gene. Does that help?
Yeah, that's thank you.
It's not the only way to go about this, by the way, but I think it's a convenient and useful thing to keep in mind. All right. So a gene is a basic unit of heredity that can be stored in DNA or RNA. Now, what does that make a gene in fact? That is, a gene then is not a material thing. It's an immaterial thing that can be stored in certain physical things, DNA and RNA. Now, this may seem just like, mathematical games I'm playing, but it's important. All right. So a gene is not physical, but it has places it can be stored in physical things. So let's move on to the next definition.
From here, it is a short step to the definition of a preen. A preen is a basic unit of information that can be stored in physical things.
Okay, that can be stored in physical things. So again, a preen then is not something that has a definite, that's material, but it can be stored in material things. Right. And we'll see examples of this that'll help clarify. Okay. So here's an example that might be helpful.
So now, instead of speaking of the insulin gene,
So the insulin gene, I think is a gene, a sequence of DNA that you can find inside of, for example, humans. And when we speak, okay, so I'll just go on.
we can speak of the insulin preen. Instead of restricting ourselves to DNA and RNA, we can consider other forms of physical things that might be storing it. Are there such things?
Okay, so the insulin gene, if we look at the definition of gene, it's something we would find stored in DNA or RNA. We could find it either of those places. When we look at the insulin preen, we're saying that it can be stored in physical things, but we haven't restricted our attention to RNA and DNA, just physical things. So, in fact, are there such things where the insulin preen is actually stored, which is not RNA and not DNA? Nathan, you look like you have an answer.
Well, people sometimes take, I guess you do call them supplements. And I don't think they have the actual DNA. It might be like in a chemical.
No, I mean, I'm not sure if you take a subsequence of DNA, I'm thinking you've cut out, as is actually possible in a laboratory. You had a long piece of DNA and you sort of snipped out a piece of it. Then you have a shorter piece of DNA, still a gene by the definition of this course. Okay. But do we find DNA? Okay. Okay. Zhao? Is it Zhao?
Yeah, you can. I go by Johnny, so whichever one you prefer is fine.
I'd like to do it right. So Zhao
It's
Machado.
actually João. Yeah, it's close enough.
Joao.
João, yeah, perfect. No, I was just gonna mention that since it's just information, anywhere we can write it, and especially computers, we could store it.
Yes. So now suddenly, if we're thinking of the insulin preen, we don't restrict our attention to RNA and DNA.
Instead of restricting ourselves to DNA and RNA, we can consider other forms of physical things that might be storing it. Are there such things? Yes. For example, the insulin preen is stored in computers, and assuming you are using your computer to read this, it is stored in yours. Here it is. Figure 1. Interestingly, storage in DNA, RNA, and computers are in some sense equivalent.
This thing has gotten
Thanks
away.
to advances in computer and biological tech.
Okay. All right.
Can I make a comment on?
Yes.
I was trying to, but I think you went ahead. So I think the previous definition of a prime versus a gene, there's something that is important, I think, is missing yet. I mean, maybe you are going to explain it next, but the gene comes with the interpretation machine. So it's not just the code, it's not just the letters stored, it's not just information. It's like that actually codes for a protein and it has a machine attached to it that can transform it, or a bunch of machines that can transform it into a protein. If you just print the gene on the paper, it's not really quite kind of the same thing, because unless you have a way of interpreting that printed copy in the paper or in a computer to really generate the protein that was intended to, is not the same function. So I think it's linked with the interpretation of the thing.
Okay, so the position of the course is that we're just going to define preen the way we defined it. Now you're pointing out that where it's stored matters.
More than where it's stored, is like you need a machine to interpret it. You can print a Python program in a piece of paper, but it doesn't execute on the paper. You need the computer to interpret the Python to do something.
Absolutely, it does not. In fact, you have to store that Python program inside a computer to get it to do something. And then you've stored it as zeros and ones, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but that's the next step. What happens to these copies? Now, if you have a copy on a piece of paper, yes, it's not going to do anything. If you now take it and put it in a computer, it might do something. Yes. But at the first level, they're all copies of this one, whatever this preen was, the Jose Luis Python algorithm preen, right? They're all going to be copies in this course. And then we're going to worry about what those copies do. And they do different things depending on where they're stored. Okay, so I don't think we're in any disagreement about anything important. It's just that I'm taking a much more ground up point of view. The definition of preens is the definition of preens. Okay, so
yes. For example, the insulin preen is stored in computers, and assuming you are using your computer to read this, it is stored in yours. Here it is.
By the way, you are using your computer to store this, right? I mean, you're watching it, it's on your
Is
computer.
Figure 1.
So here it is. Yes? All right. Now, don't worry about what's purple and what's black. That's not really important. Don't read the caption at the top that came with the picture. It's just this sequence, right? And it is a place where the insulin preen is stored. It can be stored in DNA, it can be stored in RNA, but it can also be stored in our computers. All right, now, here's an interesting thing. I think it's interesting.
Interestingly, storage in DNA, RNA, and computers are in some sense equivalent. Thanks to advances in computer and biological technology, given the insulin preen stored in one of these forms, we can create copies stored in the other two. It is remarkable that if the copy stored in your computer became the last copy that existed, it would be easy to make a plethora of new copies stored in DNA or RNA that could be used, for example, to treat some forms of diabetes. This equivalence also has surprising and disturbing consequences, as will be elucidated in the resurrection of smallpox.
Okay, so look, given that any copy in the sense of preen theory of the insulin preen, I can make a new copy in the other two forms, right? As long as I have one copy. So it doesn't really matter whether it's being stored in DNA or RNA or computers, because given one copy stored in either of those fashions, you can create the others stored in the other two fashions. You follow? I hope so, because it's an important point. Okay, you guys can see this, right? Yes. Thank you, Ciao. Yeah. Thank you, John. Sorry. Okay. So this is an important remark here. And that's one reason why it's good, I think, to look at it from the preen theoretic point of view of what a gene, in this case, the insulin gene, um, is. It doesn't matter which way it's stored because they're all the same.
I feel like, at least in my mind, there's somewhat of a difference because, like,
Okay.
if I know like genes are just chemicals and they don't actually have desires, but like a gene kind of wants to replicate itself. So if you have like multiple copies of the DNA and RNA, you could argue that that's kind of like good for the gene. But if you just take a copy machine and just print what's on your screen 200 times, that might not be.
Good point. But if you just take a copy machine and print out that sequence a million times, you've reproduced that sequence. So you mean if it's stored in DNA and it gets reproduced by a cell, that counts. But if it gets reproduced by the internet or something like that, that doesn't count. Well, I'm saying they both count, but admitting that they're different. Okay. So, and then I have this final thing that this equivalence has surprising and disturbing consequences, as will be elucidated in the resurrection of smallpox, right? And we'll get to that. You saw it referred to in the first lecture. Okay. So this is this difference in the way we look at what a gene is really matters, as we'll see.
We will refer to preens derived from genes in the manner just described as genetic preen.
So we didn't have to take the insulin gene and consider it as a preen. All of the things we call genes, or more generally, all of the sequences, A, T, Cs, and Gs, become genetic preens in this course. Okay.
Now that we have a definition of
Yes.
preens,
I'm thinking about
Somebody-
what
Raise
Nathan said, and maybe what we talked about earlier with genes trying to survive, where with insulin in particular, it seems like one of the reasons that we have so many copies of it in our computers is because like it fails really often. So we they want to copy it in order to like be able to replace its function. And it seems like this sort of like cloning itself in computers is sort of at odds with this idea of it trying to survive on its own.
Well, like I say, if you cloned it in a bunch of computers and some catastrophe occurred, now, I mean, I guess, and all of the actual DNA molecules went away and all the RNA molecules went away, and you just had one copy on your computer, I could go in a lab and create the molecules. Now, if those all went away, there'd be no people to give it to, but that's a different story. But I could still create it. So at least we can see that the insulin gene can survive just as a computer copy. So it's a lot to think about. I agree. But this is a good point in the course. I'm trying to change your ideas of what you perceive is going on, right? And you're asking the right questions. Not all copies have the same function, you could say, but they all exist, right? And so this is a very bottom-up approach, little steps at a time till we get to a grander view. It's okay. So anyway, okay.
We will refer to preens derived from genes in the manner just described as genetic preens.
So there's a lot of genetic preens by this, right? Okay.
Now that we have a definition of preens, we might ask whether genetic preens are the only examples?
So are they the only examples of information that can be stored in physical things? All right. So
To be, or
and it turns out the answer is
the answer is no. Consider this. To be, or not to be, that is the question.
now you saw that in the first lecture. I also taught it. So
Figure 2, the Hamlet soliloquy preen stored in the Brandeis.
sorry, guys. Okay. So the Hamlet soliloquy.
Hamlet's soliloquy. It is stored in books as a sequence of letters. It is stored in computers as a sequence of zeros and ones. It is stored in people's brains in a manner yet to be elucidated by science. So, what is Hamlet's soliloquy? It is a preen, which we will call the Hamlet's soliloquy preen. Figure 2.
So here it is. Here's the Hamlet soliloquy preen stored in a book, a first folio from 1620 or so. Here it is on a computer, and here it is being stored in Laurence Olivier's brain. For those of you who are too young to know, Laurence Olivier was a famous actor back in the day, and he did a Hamlet. And this is, I think, the moment when he gives the soliloquy. So it's up in his brain. It's another place it's stored. Okay. All right. By the way, by being stored in a computer, it's what was called a tureen, the thing stored in a computer. And by being stored in Olivier's brain, it's what we call a meme. So it can be stored various ways.
Hamlet's soliloquy is clearly not a gene, and therefore, the Hamlet soliloquy preen is not a genetic preen. It is our first example of a cultural preen.
Okay, so here's the first example of a cultural preen, Hamlet's soliloquy. It's a, quote, unit of information that can be stored in physical things, and we've seen 3 physical things that store it.
A copy of a preen is a physical object that stores it. The most important thing to know about a preen is its current copy number, the number of distinct physical things in which it is stored at this moment. It is likely that the Hamlet soliloquy preen is currently stored in millions of books, millions of computers, and tens of thousands of brains. Perhaps, its current copy number exceeds 1 billion.
Right? So there's a lot of copies out there.
Do we consider all copies to be equally valuable? Like I would
No,
consider, sorry?
The answer is no. We just consider them to be copies. But later we'll get into what do those copies do? And it's clear that they do different things, right? You know, so at any rate, they do different things, and we'll discuss that. but they are nonetheless copies.
How would you determine if something's a copy? Like if I was to write it down, but my handwriting was so bad, no one could read it, that might be somewhat not a copy.
Yes, so you're getting to a question that we will address later. What is Hamlet's soliloquy? Well, to humans, we all have a Hamlet's soliloquy, what would I call it? Our own personal Hamlet soliloquy preem, which basically is all the things you would point to and say that's Hamlet's soliloquy. And you and I may have different Hamlet soliloquy preem. We'd probably accept those three images I showed you as all Hamlet soliloquy because we would agree. But for example, if it's written in Swahili, I might not see it as Hamlet soliloquy, but someone, who speaks Swahili might. Yes. So we, in fact, all have different preems, but it's a convenience to not get into that right now. All right. Okay. So, right now, let's see, do we want to get into this notion? All right. So we can think of, for example, the dinosaur genome preem, by which I mean the dinosaur's entire DNA sequence. And now that's stored in, it was stored in dinosaurs, right? As they had cells, they had the sequence in there. Yes. So what was the copy number of the dinosaur preem back in, say, 68 million years ago?
Millions.
Yes, right, Julian. Millions, right? In fact, probably trillions would be more like it, because presumably there were millions of dinosaurs back then. But remember, each one we have about 10 to the 14th cells. Let's assume they did. So you get 1,000,000 times 10 to the 14th, which brings you up to 10 to the 20th. Lots of copies, right? Now, what was it in, say, 64 million years ago? Any ideas? Huh?
Less than
Thousands, I
that.
don't know. It was after the meteor hit, so definitely not a lot. Um,
Zero.
Well, I wouldn't argue at zero because some of the information was preserved in things like fossils.
No, it wasn't. So in terms of the actual sequences of the DNA that were harbored inside of dinosaurs before the Chicxulub impactor arrived, it's true we have bones, but we have no reliable way of getting DNA and sequencing it from an object as old as 66 million years ago. Okay, there is no way to do it. The DNA is all gone away. I mean, broken down into more fundamental components. So you can't sequence anything from that long ago. All right. How many human genome preens are there? Well, there's about 10 to the 14 cells, and let's call it 10 billion of us. That's 10 to the 10th. It's not quite 10 billion, but we're almost there. So it's about 10 to the 10th times 10 to the 14th, which is about 10 to the 24th. And I think if we really counted carefully, we'd find out that the actual number is Avogadro's number. It's a joke. Anyway, but 10 to the 24th is around Avogadro's number. Okay, so how many will there be in 1,000 years from now? Human genome preems. How many copies? Yeah, it's kind of a interesting question. Yes, it depends on what you think the future is going to be. Yes.
yeah, don't they
Could
think
we get
the Earth can hold a max of 11 billion? So, and then obviously there might be human bones underground, maybe human skin cells that are dead, but you can still get the DNA from.
Oh, well, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that, Julian. Okay, well, let's make it 1 million years from now. Then we can extract stuff that's probably safe. And of course, it depends on what happens to us as a species. Yes, we may not be here at all, or we may be all over the universe. Who knows? Okay. Now, let's see.
If the current copy number of a preen drops to 0, the preen has gone extinct. For example, it is known that some of Shakespeare's plays have been lost, so, barring a miraculous find, the preens once stored in written copies of those plays have gone extinct. The same can be said for the genetic preens associated with many Tyrannosaurus rex genes.
Okay. So, yeah, so surprisingly, we do know Hamlet's soliloquy, preen, obviously, and it seems to be doing fairly well these days in terms of copy number. But back in Shakespeare's time, Hamlet's soliloquy was written around 1600, 1601 maybe. But we know Shakespeare wrote other plays because they're listed on the official list of plays that were maintained in Elizabethan England. But there's no copies that have ever reached us. And so all the preens that might be in there, stored in copies of those plays, are presumably, unless something amazing happens, lost to us forever. They've gone extinct. Yes. So, any other interesting examples that occurred to you?
What about something like the preen for the Pythagorean theorem, where like if it were to go extinct, I think we could be reasonably certain someone would rediscover it.
Oh, that's a really interesting example, Grayson. Yeah, so I think you're right. So it's certainly been created independently in many civilizations, uh, including, of course, the Greek version, but it seems to have been known maybe to the Babylonians and I'm pretty sure in other cultures as well. So you're right. If it did go extinct, and as long as there were humans around in some kind of civilization, it would probably go unextinct. That is, it would have dropped to zero, but then it can make a comeback. It's a good point. I never had a good example of that, so I'll steal yours in the future. Okay, yeah. Well, what's your take on that? So you can go extinct and come back. Mhm.
I think that could happen, but only if it's useful or simple enough, you know?
If you come back, then you were never extinct, right? Just
Well,
because you
not
found a new
according to this.
copy doesn't mean that that copy didn't exist. You just didn't know about it. It was still there.
No, 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 no. I think what Grayson's saying is different than that. Let's say some catastrophe occurs, and the only survivors are people on Antarctica. And well, they might know the Pythagorean theorem. Let's say it's one of those so-called uncontacted tribes in the Amazon basin. You know what I mean? About those guys. If you have never looked at pictures of those guys, it's just freaking amazing. Uh, at any rate, uh, so what if some catastrophe wiped us all out, but the untouched, uncontacted tribes in the Amazon basin survived? Now, I'm willing to accept that maybe no person left alive would know the Pythagorean theorem, and there'd be no copies of it left, whatever this catastrophe is. But I'm also willing to accept that given another sufficiently long time, those tribes would eventually morph and form other societies, and maybe some of them would discover mathematics and might eventually come up with the Pythagorean theorem.
Could you not argue that the Pythagorean theorem is itself encoded in the notion of math, which is still sort of inherently somehow encoded in humans, because humans seem to have a knack for constantly inventing math?
Now you're getting into really deep questions as well. And they're philosophical and they're worth asking. And this is the question of what is inherently in our brains? Is there really you know, something inherent in our brain that leads us to mathematics? I don't know, but a good question. And these are the questions that I'd like to know the answers of. And by the way, since you asked such a good question, so I guess the question is, oh, well, okay, we'll get to that later. But be aware that many of the questions that arise here, I don't know the answers to. And it's an invitation of you guys to figure out the answers. And if you figure out a really good answer for something, by all means, let me know. Okay, so but back to, oh, yes, John?
Yeah, I was just wondering if maybe the the Pythagorean theorem example is not a consequence of like a feature of the fact that preens are subjective in the way that Nathan was saying before. What one person thinks of a preen may be different from what another person considers a preen. So maybe a feature of this subjectivity is these the fact that the preen can go extinct and then come back.
Yeah, I follow that. Now, I took the point of view. Let me think about something. All right, I should say something. This won't resolve the question. But in DTD, I give an alternative definition of preens. There's a chapter, What is a preen, which I think is here. There's also another one later that, what is a preen really? And in that view, you might make some headway on these kind of issues. So I do think you guys have enlightened me that, yeah, I think things can, according to the definition I just gave, go extinct and then go unextinct. Something I had not really considered. So should I change the notion of going extinct to something else?
I mean,
Yeah.
Professor,
I
I had
think
a thought about
Nathan?
that. I was thinking,
Yes, Nathan.
sorry.
Nathaniel.
Sorry. Yeah, I changed my name because I know it's a little confusing between the two of us. I was thinking there might be an idea where preens can store can store other preens essentially, right? So this is not exactly the Pythagorean theorem, but like for example, the preen for just like a perfect circle stores the preen for like the sequence of pi essentially. So we can have the pi, preen of pi isolated, but with a little bit of discovery, the preen of the circle is a copy of the preen of pi because we can discover it somehow.
Wow, I don't know what to make of that. It's a path you could try to go down, Nathaniel,
Mhm.
but I'd be pessimistic you wouldn't run into an abyss, just
Mhm.
a bog down. One of the things that I experienced in 50 years of wandering around Preenland is numerous cases where I thought I could understand something I'd found, and then it just didn't work out. But it took me a long time to see it didn't work out. My intuition about your ideas is it's not going to work out, but that doesn't mean it's not going to work out, right? So that's the state of things. Yes, Nathan, you also had a remark.
I was wondering if there's like somehow a 1 in like 4 to the a billion chance that some sequence of mutations would kind of unextinct the dinosaurs. And obviously the probability is astronomically low. But what if the only difference between that and the Pythagorean theorem is that with the Pythagorean theorem, it's just a higher probability?
Yeah, I agree with you. You've asked a very good question. Maybe our co-host, Professor Dr. Biebel, has something to say. Yes,
Yeah,
Joe.
yeah. So it's an interesting question of over whether some preen like the Pythagorean theorem or the digits of pi, would exist. I'll say hypothetically, just to make it a really extreme example, suppose that life evolved in some galaxy that was hundreds of millions of light years away,
Far away.
far away from us, and
Yes.
and let's suppose that the light tones or whatever of our lifetimes and this alien lifetimes never intersect. Namely, humans exist and then go extinct, and then the other life exists and then goes extinct, but can never, because of the distance, can never, intersect informationally.
Okay.
And so you would expect, I think, as you've concluded, that because the fitness landscape of life is such that some preens like Pythagorean theorem or digits of pi would evolve, that they would happen in both places. But it doesn't really make sense to say, well, it went extinct and then came back because no causality, right? That you can't argue that one event happens before the other.
Okay, so
If I can I add just one more concept from my
yeah,
point of
Marco.
view. I think if I think about extinct, let's talk about animals and plants. There's tons of animals that are extinct, and then tons of plants that are extinct. But I've seen there are plants we thought they were extinct, and actually they aren't. So
Yes.
not that they were extinct and then they turned, they switched and became unextinct. We made a mistake. So they were never extinct, period. So I think it's not that you have to change the concept of extinct because to turn it from extinct to unextinct and maybe go back to extinct again. Extinct is extinct, and if we found something that we thought was extinct and it actually isn't, we just made a mistake.
Well, yes, and we can certainly do that. The definition of preens does not require that some human knows whether a preen has in fact gone extinct or not, if there's 0 copies. It doesn't require that. I mean, it's just extinct means a preen that has no copies. Whether humans know whether it has any copies or not is irrelevant, even
Right.
if, yeah. So I think we're okay there. But okay, so what Joe's saying is, I think that do things become unextinct suggested that suggests some sort of causality, that the thing sort of resided in some netherland and then came back. And I think I've got a definition that I sort of have to live with or change, right? Right now, as we've defined extinct, things can come back. I mean, just the case. So,
Yeah, but there's a difference between evolving again, the same preen, and
yeah,
the copy number was not really 0. And
yeah.
yeah.
So maybe a better word would be quiescent rather than extinct. Quiescent means sort of like it stopped making any sounds, right? Okay, well, look, thank you. You've raised a very good question. And as usual, I don't have an answer. And so this is a good example of something that I'm going to have to think about because it's a problem in the current definitions. And I probably got it wrong. But it's also it is also a question that therefore none of us know the answer to. And if you want to, think about what the right answer is. This is you've been dropped off in preen land. Here's a question worth exploring. And if you want to take up that challenge, and if you come up with something, we'll provide a forum to hear your answer.